Welcome to Committing Faith in Public, a podcast for people who want to be inspired by individuals and communities of faith, working for a more just, kind, and hospitable society. Through the stories our guests tell, we want to encourage you to commit your faith in public too. I'm Gary Peluso-Verdend, Executive Director of the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My guest today is the Reverend Dr. Chelsea Yarborough. She's an assistant professor of liturgical studies at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, a place where I earned both my MDiv and also served on faculty and staff for 5 years, so it's close to my heart. Dr. Yarborough recently completed a PhD at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She's one of the speakers this year at Phillips Remind and Renew event, January 25th to 27 in Tulsa. On the Remind and Renew webpage, it says Dr. Yarborough is a professor and minister known for exploring liturgy in the context of Black theology and preaching outside the pulpit. Her ordination is in the National Baptist Convention. Dr. Chelsea Yarborough, welcome to Committing Faith in Public.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so great to have you. Hey, tell us some about your work. How do you describe what it is you do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Particularly in the academy. I think it's helpful to first situate myself. So I'm a Black feminist and womanist practical theologian who focuses their attention on preaching and worship as like my space of inquiry for what it means for communities to engage in faith formation and what it means for individuals to create some sort of inbreaking or opening to new realities through rhetoric and ritual. So in that, I center the experiences of Black women, which have often been ignored or mismanaged in academic inquiry, as the site for my own theoretical assertions. So I study historical Black women. I study the contemporary kind of phenomena of what's happening now. And I'm always looking to create new lineages that push against the kind of normative genres that I know were created without Black women in mind. And so what happens when Black women are centered, the kind of normative understandings of liturgy begin to move, what preaching is and can be and who we look to as our kind of preaching elders and canons begins to shift. And my hope is that, I open up the possibilities for more freedom, more hope, more justice for those for whom those things are not often afforded.
Wow. I'd like to follow up on a bunch of that, but we're going to have to do that in another time. That sounds like fascinating work. Today, I want to focus more on particularly, and we'll certainly get into your work this way, with the word ritual. We hear the word ritual used in both ecclesial or church settings, liturgical settings and the like, but also in public settings. When we're talking about ritual, what is it we're talking about?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because especially now as spirituality becomes moved into different sectors and different public spaces, I think the word ritual is used so frequently that it's like, wait, what is this thing that we're talking about? Is the ritual of marriage the same as my ritual of waking up in the morning and drinking my tea intentionally? Or it's like, what are we saying? And so I think when I think about what ritual is at its core, is that it's an intentional container that allows for kind of a moment to be held that represents a larger journey and possibility of a moment. So like the ritual of marriage or a ritual of a wedding represents a much longer marriage, ideally. Right? The ritual of when I talk about to like clients and colleagues around what rituals they can start their day with, the ritual of meditation and drinking your tea in an intentional way is really kind of marking time for what we hope to be a peaceful and more fluid experience. And so I think at its core, ritual is an intentional inbreaking into what could be otherwise, that intentionally like moves us beyond the kind of chronology of everyday time to remind us that we're moving towards something otherwise.
Okay. So can you give us some examples from, you gave some examples such as a wedding ritual.
Yeah.
or a morning routine that in a done in a particular way can become a ritual. Can you think of some other rituals from public life just to help people orient that, we see rituals with some regularity besides in our worship context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one that's coming to my mind is the rituals around, and I'm highlighting rituals that I enjoy and that I want to keep happening on purpose.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other things that are happening with regularity that don't need to be. But one thing that is coming to mind in public life is the ritual of protest, and the way that protest kind of creates a necessary disruption to the kind of everydayness that points people towards the possibility of what a more just and whole world would look like. And so it's interesting because what folks who are not often oriented in protest spaces see as chaotic is actually like a fairly ordered space. Like there are usually openings at protests. There's some type of invitation. There's some type of movement. And so if there's a following of a what one might call a service, what others don't need to, but it creates this container that says like what is does not have to be. And so through this ritual, hopefully there's a kind of breaking in to what could be the everydayness of life, but what we know it not to be now.
That's a really interesting one. With there being some expected elements, some expected practices are part along the way, but also that very interesting, I think, as you're talking about the disruption of a timeline in a way that opens hope but also like I say, it's a disruption of what's wrong, and so it just thinking about protest in terms of the rituals around it, I think is really helpful. So one of the things that I find fascinating about ritual is and my own what has been I think too unidimensional understanding of ritual is when one thinks about ritual in terms of both time and place. I think I was certainly when I came through Garrett-Evangelical and my seminary experience, both in theology as well as in biblical theology, salvation history was all the thing. And coming out of the German schools, the Heilsgeschichte, that this is the Bible and theology is all about a history of salvation, which puts nearly everything about Christianity on an historical timeline that has to do with people, but not necessarily connecting people with place and space, nor connecting people with God's larger creation and world. I'm curious how your own work in ritual may highlight and call attention to not only time but also place and space.
Yeah, so I think often when I think about both time and space, honestly, of like who has the luxury of it, like who has, and it's interesting because people will be like, well, everyone has time, and we decide what we do with it, or and that's just, I will say that everyone does not have time in the same way, and everyone does not have the luxury of space in the same way. So when I think about ritual and the way it, in my opinion, offers new space and disrupts like the everydayness of time, I think about how critical it's been as a strategy for justice, because you have, particularly I'm thinking about Black women, this is my work, particularly the ways that Black women have carved space when like society has said like, you are labor and not life, or have marked time and created their own sense of what it means to be alive and what it means to birth and what it means to be well and what it means to declare your own flourishing in a space that like is pretty created for your demise, that these rituals of, I'm thinking of rituals of care amidst Black women, rituals of hospitality towards other people that did not deserve their hospitality, right? And what it means to like, how do I want to say this? What it means to actually declare that all space and all time is sacred, and to move through life in that way, so that the ritual is not necessarily, this is now sacred time, as much as it is time is always sacred. Let's notice it. And I think that that's a different orientation that comes from womanist thought, and that comes from centering the way that Black women have to look at the divinity that comes from within as a way to honor, acknowledge, and be in community with the divinity beyond us and around us.
Yeah. Yeah. It actually reminds me too of Martin Buber made a comment that there is only the holy and the not yet holy.
That's it. That's it. Because like, you know, it's holy once we decide it is, right? It's sacred once we decide it is.
Right.
And if I decide that I am sacred, which I already have, or if I decide that I am a sacred place, then where I move and where I step also becomes sacred and holy ground. And so then I use rituals to mark it for myself, but also to mark it for others who might not be witnessing life in the same way I am.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. Yeah, it was my reading in Vine Deloria, and then in Robin Wall Kimmerer and Braiding Sweetgrass, which has become like that could be my all-time favorite book now.
Yeah, I love that book. It's a great one.
Yeah, and just the attention to, I mean, both really talk about the ritualization of space and the importance of place. And rather than just a historical timeline tied some way to development and progress, and there was a more primitive time and now we're in a more developed time and all that kind of thing, which sometimes I think the disruption of thinking about ritual and place is well, what happened in that place? And I think so much of the protest, as you mentioned earlier, so much of protest is about something bad, some unjust suffering, murders, abuse and like that have happened within that particular place, and then creating rituals in that place is a disruption again of that timeline of everything's always gotten better.
It's interesting that you brought Braiding Sweetgrass up, because I think what she does well in that book is invite us to look at the kind of minutia of space, like look at like this one blade of grass, or look at this like one berry, or look at this and like see it as a part of a much wider and more abundant ecosystem, but also to note that like that one blade of grass also has a story. And so it's pretty powerful to me when we think about people in that same way and in that same ecosystem, is just like, yes, we are vast and plentiful and there are major moods that we have to shift. But what ritual also does is honor the individual and says like, what is your narrative that brought you to this place? And like, what is this space saying to you? Because what this ground means to one person is not going to mean the same to the other. And then for Black people to be on ground that was forced upon us, right? And to still be able to find places to call it sacred, to me is such a profound and really mind-boggling phenomena that Black people still see this earth, and particularly this country, and find ways to mark and push for and expand the possibilities of what hopefulness and flourishing and wellness might look for our bodies in this space, knowing that the actual timeline and the actual creation of place and space was literally meant for our destruction.
Yeah. Yeah. Your comments remind me of something I think of in terms of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is a place that was promised as hopeful to Native peoples, to free Black peoples.
Absolutely.
And also then to everybody who participated in the land runs. So there was this mixing of really a lot of what's made for what America is right here in Oklahoma, and that each with a different story, each with a different sense of place, and what this place meant to them, that we still see playing out in Oklahoma politics and
I'm sure
church life and the like. So it's always it's something I was unaware of until really living here and becoming as resident as I've wound up becoming. And I really can't call myself a Chicagoland person anymore. I've been 27 or so years in this area. So
yeah, no, the shift is real. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which again is another marking of space that you just named. How we learn.
Absolutely right. And one of those markings of space and time that's been very important here, especially in the Tulsa area, that got national attention over the last year, was the marking of the 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre in May and early June 1st of 1921. And there's been a really important conversation, I would say on and off, but that was mostly on during the last year here around reparations. And for me, thinking in terms of what it is that people of faith may have to contribute to public life for a better public and not just a greater church, is around social repair. If we're really interested in social repair and social healing, what is it that we need to do? What is it also that people of faith may have to offer? And I think about all of the pieces of social repair that are part of the Christian tradition, from confession and penance and eventually forgiveness and reconciliation, but not usually a jump from confession to forgiveness without there being something more in between, and especially in this stressed time, both in the culture as well as in our churches, for somewhat similar and somewhat different reasons. But the pandemic and this era of what I hope is truly an era of racial reckoning, these are stressors in the culture, stressors in the churches, and there's clearly a significant amount of social upheaval, social unrest, and a hope. I would hope that that unrest is not our permanent condition. Some sort of repair is possible, so that we might actually, as all of our this diversity of peoples here in this nation, might actually figure out a way to live together in a more just and equal democratic society, which some days I'm hopeful about and other days not so much.
Yeah.
So tell me about some of your take on the kind of the rituals we have within the Christian tradition, which, whether regardless of their strength today, may be resources that if we were powerful in the way we practice them within our faith communities, we also might have something to offer for social repair in the larger society.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I have so much to say.
Good.
So I think I want to start here in that. So social repair is really loaded for me, because when I think about it, and I have these conversations often because I do a lot of work with pastors who are trying to think through what it means. A lot of white pastors who are trying to think through what it means to have a multicultural congregation. And my question is always, who is that for? Like, because people, I really want to have multicultural worship. I want to have multicultural congregation. And I was like, well, who is it for? And like, where are you pulling people from to have this space? Because like, I'm not leaving. All churches have their own problems, but I'm not leaving the Black church to go to a multicultural church in the name of someone else's idea of like this looking like reconciliation. And so we have these conversations. And what I've noticed is that the conversation around social repair is often, alongside a couple of things, either this like idea of some community that people have found in their minds in the text that was like perfect, which like, if you read the Bible, it's like not really not there, right. Really not there at all.
Right.
Or this kind of, utopia we've created in our mind where somehow justice like emerges like a tree or something. And I think that for me, the word I prefer is social reimagining, because I don't think that there's any sort of repair. That repair is like going back to something that feels like justice or equity to me. There's no world that has existed since any sense of the colonial age, which like we don't really, have much, it's hard to extract our world at this point from colonialism in any sort of way.
Right.
That I would want to return to. And so when I think of social reimagining, to me, there's a helpful kind of like opening there, because it allows for us to actually begin to name not just what we see, but also what we are willing to then give up to see it. And so I think one of the practices that comes up for me is, which is like, it sounds so basic, but is repentance. But it's not the rhetoric of repentance. It's the ritual of it. It's the doing. It's the turning from. And so it's like, okay, we can say, we want more equitable whatevers, but like, what are we in our individual selves, and what are we collectively and systemically actually giving up to tear down the frameworks that exist, because they exist on the backs of the disenfranchised. And so like our systems just can't live as is. And so I think when I think of repentance, I think of like a reckoning that it's not going to be comfortable and it's not going to be cute. It's going to be really difficult, because it's a disruption of everything we know the world to be. And so I think that, again, repentance is one of the practices of not just naming the ills, but turning away from them intentionally as a daily practice. And then I also think of the necessity of lament, but making sure that lament is done in a way that does not put extra labor on those that are already having to labor a lot. And so I was brought into a space one time. They were creating a healing circle. And I said yes. And because I was intrigued mostly. And there were 3 Black pastors in there, 3 Black clergy, I was included, and like 25 white pastors. And it became this 2-hour weeping session of these white pastors being like, I'm so sorry for how like hard it's been for you. And it was so incredibly uncomfortable, because I saw the tears, but I didn't hear the change. There was nothing said that told me that like, and now we're going to give half of our church's tithing to this organization, or now we're going to cut our, income, knowing that like, if we're living above this line, we live on the backs of these other people. And when I say this kind of stuff, you're like, well, that's hard. People have families, people have stuff. And I said, I get it. It is hard, but that kind of disruption, that kind of turning into something otherwise is the fodder and the foundation for a type of reimagining of what it means for us to live together. And so, yeah, I think of those 2 things, lament and repentance, but then in a more hopeful sense, I think of practices of table. Like, how do we gather together? How do we fellowship? And when I think of like the tables that are my favorite, it's kind of like the potluck table. How do we all bring things together that we enjoy, but like taste the home of someone else? That we might all leave more fed, more well, more whole than how we came to the table. And so there are the practices of tables that we sit at, and then there are practices of table that we turn over. And I think that both practices are critical, and both practices are very rooted in our Christian faith.
Mm-hmm. I love that, and I'd like to talk to you further about it. I hope I get a chance to in January. And I appreciate very much the social reimagining versus social repair, because, I am of the school that says that we're trying something in, or this moment in American history at least, we are trying to do something that hasn't been done before. It's not a matter of restoring some past golden age. It really is can you have a multicultural, shared power, more equal democracy in a way that the world's not seen it before. And so it is a reimagining. So I appreciate that on the repair. The last thing I want to ask though is repentance, which is, I think that's also as the reparations conversations that have happened here. Mm-hmm. That's a form, or certainly reparations is a form of repentance. And what's so interesting to me is, if I understand correctly, Martin Luther, when he was reducing the Catholic sacraments down to two, as the other reformers did too, of the two dominical sacraments that have come from the Lord, of baptism and communion, he was hesitant to give up on repentance. Repentance and actually is penance. Mm-hmm. I guess it was on penance. And that is, I find, at least in my own experience in predominantly white Protestant congregations, talking about repentance, somewhat as a kind of a change of heart, but talking about penance, that's not in our conversation. It's like, no, that's all been paid for. Mm-hmm. And rather than, no, that's actually a critical element of the way that human communities actually might be able to repair.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that to use that framework, it's like, if repentance is the rhetoric, then penance is the practice. And so it's just like, cool, like, we know that this went left. And I also think that's important to note that, like, when injustice is done, when things have been, injustice almost feels, because it's so, like, we talk about it so often, almost feels like so light of a thing to say. Yeah, when, like, egregious and inhumane and, like, horrific and, like, horrendous acts are done, there is actually nothing that can be done on the other side that will justify or make right that issue. When lives are lost, it's so interesting to me when people are like, oh, like, justice for name any of the many Black lives that have been slaughtered at the hands of those called to protect and serve. So, like, justice for this person. And it's like, yeah, we want folks to be convicted, but a life was lost. A family is grieving. A community has been disrupted. And that doesn't stop. It just makes it even worse and more of a slap in the face and more, horrible when folks don't just get to do it, but also get off for it. And so, like, when I think about penance, to me, I think of, like, the text is simply the reasonable service of the society to offer all that it can, knowing it actually will never be enough, because life and breath is not something that can be replaced. And I think that to me is what's interesting around the conversations of justice. Is I find that sometimes it's around, like, how do we make it even? Like, how do we make it right? And I think the reality is, like, we actually can't. But how can we do what is most right is really the question. How can we do what is most well? And how can we turn away that these practices are not what is normal anymore? And these injustices, to use the word that I just said I wasn't going to use, but these injustices are not what we are accustomed to. I think that's the change. And so, again, social reimagining for me is deep spiritual work that manifests itself in the pragmatic, in the everydayness.
Yeah. And I think that maybe that's where lament also intersects with what we're talking about, as you mentioned earlier, that, I think lamentation is both a a cry against injustice, and also something of an acknowledgement of something which can't be fixed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a different space to live in. That's a different space to live in.
It is really, it's hard. It's deep grief. It's deep grief. And in there's hope is I think is an important word, because I think of like the spirituals and the ways that they hold hope and lament together. And so it's like hope sometimes it's just like, I'll show up tomorrow and see. And like, sometimes that has to be enough, but it can't be that has to be enough for those who have suffered under the hands of injustice. It can't be enough for those that have had the privilege of not. And I think when I think about what a new world might look like, or I ideate about this often, I'm also just like, I don't know if the privilege can be in power. I don't know if that can even be a just world. And I think that is also a massive disruption, is I don't actually think it's equality in leadership anymore. I think it's equity. And what we know about the way the world has already turned is that there have been some folks who have been in power for a very long time. And so for the tables to turn, again, it just has to be a reimagining of what it even says, what we even think that we're doing here as humans in community with one another, the earth and God. So lots of conversations to have.
Absolutely. Dr. Chelsea Yarborough, thanks so much for being on with me this morning. And I really look forward to hearing you and getting to meet you at Remind and Renew, January 25th to 27th.
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
This has been Committing Faith in Public, a podcast from the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips Theological Seminary. Copyright Phillips Theological Seminary and Gary Peluso-Verdend. The views and opinions expressed during the podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect official positions of Phillips Theological Seminary.